Just like the execute SQL task, the file system task requires one or more connection managers, because this task by its nature accesses resources outside of integration services. For tasks that copy files or directories, you'll need to specify a connection for the source and another for the destination. When you configure the file system task, some of the properties provide a fair amount of flexibility at runtime. For example, a copy file task includes an overwrite destination property, and a create directory task includes a use directory if exists property. These properties let the task complete successfully even if the objects already exist when the package runs. This makes repeated execution during debugging and testing much easier. Now, one benefit of this task is that when you create a directory, you don't have to perform separate steps to create each folder in the hierarchy. For example, say that the folder C Learn Now already exists on your hard drive, and you need to create this folder, C Learn Now My Files Beyond ETL Archive, or whatever it might be. But My Files, Beyond ETL, and Archive don't already exist. Well, you can use the file system task to create that full path in one step, instead of in 3 separate steps, one for each new folder. This efficiency doesn't apply to file operations, though. You can't rename a file to move it to a new path. So the task has a few idiosyncrasies that you need to deal with. Now, the file system task can handle nearly any file management need, especially when you use it along with a for each loop container. The task is almost made for loops, since it can perform only one operation at a time. Within a loop, it can perform an operation on an entire set of files or folders. What I'm going to do now is add a file system task to my execute SQL package. And then I'm also, of course, going to configure it. What the task is going to do is it's going to create a staging folder on my C drive that I can use for an eventual export of data to that location. So probably a flat file. Now, like I said, I'm going to add this to my execute SQL package, but I could create a new package too, because this new task isn't going to do anything that affects this reset staging table. So just for convenience, I'm going to put them in the same package, not use any precedence constraints to tie them together because they really are 2 independent tasks. All right, I'll go over here to the SSIS toolbox. And here within the Common section, I'm going to drag the file system task to my surface here. And I'll move that over. And you can see the jumping around. That seems to be some aspect of how Visual Studio is displaying the designer. It happens in all the machines that I use. So it happens in all the machines that I use. So hopefully it's something that Microsoft fixes in some future version of Data Tools. All right, first thing I want to do is right-click on this and rename it. And I want to call this Create Export Directory. And hit Enter. Okay, so there's a new task. You can see that it has the red X. I can hover over it and say source path is not valid on the operation copy file. So the default settings just aren't good enough, so I need to configure it. So I'm going to open up the task editor. I just double-clicked on it. And the first thing I want to do is set the operation. This is pretty important as the first thing to do with a file system task, because it's going to determine what other properties are available within the task editor. So in this case, I don't want to copy a file. I want to create a directory. And there's that option right there, but there you can see all of the options for the various kinds of things that you can do with this task. Okay, and as you can see, the set of properties changed a little bit. Some went away, some new ones were introduced. All right, next I need to create a connection for this task. So I'll select Source Connection and select the drop-down list there. Notice that I don't have any connections that are appropriate for this kind of task. I do have some connections that are available, but they aren't file or folder oriented. They're not file system kind of connections. So I need to create a new connection, and I'll click that right there. All right, I need to change the usage type from existing file to create folder. And then I need to specify the folder. Now, for a lot of operations, I could click on Browse, but this folder doesn't exist yet, so it's a lot easier just to type it in. If it was a subfolder of another existing folder that was nested deeply someplace, I could use the Browse button to navigate to get most of the path and then modify this text box here. But in this case, it's just the root, off the root of the C, so it's easier just to type it in. All right, so C is staging. Okay, I'll click on OK, and notice that we now have a source connection. And it's called just staging, so it's stripped off the C:\\. Next thing I want to do is change the value of use directory if exists. The default is false, which means that if I execute this task and staging already exists on the C drive, then the task would fail. But I'm just double click on that, change it to true, and now I can execute the task. If the folder's already there, it just continues on and completes successfully. All right, so that's all I need to do in order to configure this task for what I need it to do. So I'll click on OK. And now we have that create export directory task there within the execute SQL package. Now, the next thing is kind of cool. You might expect that I would have to execute this entire package in order to execute each task, but that's not the case. What I can do instead is just right-click on this and select Execute Task. Now this is a big benefit because if you have a very complex control flow that's doing a lot of things, takes a lot of time to execute, whatever, then during development that can be a real pain. But instead, when I define a single task here within the control flow designer, I can execute just that task. Now it's a problem if this task depended upon other tasks executing first, like creating a file that isn't otherwise there, then I may need to execute the entire package. But in this case, this is just a standalone task as I explained before, and so I can execute just this single task. So I'll click on that. There's a quick compilation step, and it's a very quick task, so we don't get the yellow flashing icon to indicate that it's in progress, but it completed successfully. And notice that this one did not execute at all. So in fact, we can come over here to the progress, and we can see that just this single task executed. Okay, so I'll stop debugging, and I'll come over here to Windows Explorer, and you can see that it created the staging folder. And just to let you know, there's nothing up my sleeves. It's an empty folder. It was literally just created a moment ago. Okay, so I'm going to come back over here, and I'm going to execute the task again. Okay, a little bit quicker that time. Notice that it completed successfully. And that's even though the directory already exists. And just confirm, make absolute sure, yep, it's still there. Okay, now this happened because I set the use directory if exists property to true. If I hadn't done that, then I would have gotten an error and a message would have appeared that said that the directory already exists, so it couldn't create the directory. And that's good in some cases, but in this case I want to be able to execute this package. If staging is already there, fine, we just move on with the next task. But in a real package, if you use that option, you may need to also say empty out that folder, because if subsequent tasks assume that that folder is empty, then you need to make sure that that assumption is met. But then you can also go down here into the output window and notice that we did get a warning that says that the directory already exists. Okay, so you get some feedback and some actual status information about what actually occurred when this task executed.